you guys remember hearing about the Punic Wars in school? This is a series of fights between the Carthaginians in North Africa and the Romans in, Rome that took place 100, 200 years before the time of Jesus. And this is like three big chunks of warfare that happened. The Carthaginians are this refined, intellectual, literary culture. They're the descendants of the Phoenicians from the Levant, so like phonics. These are smart people. And then you got the Romans, and obviously they're smart people, and maybe they were just too smart to be in that close of proximity to each other. But they fight a whole bunch. It turns really ugly. This is where we get the legendary General Hannibal, who wages war even with elephants, that he took over the Alps and then went down the Italian peninsula and caused all kinds of problems for the Romans there. But when it's all said and done, the Romans sort of win this war of economic attrition. They just have more cooking in their empire. And the Carthaginians are defeated and then humiliated, according to the article that I read as a kid in the encyclopedias that my parents bought every other week at the local grocery store, which obviously means that they were reliable and true. And then they came down, and the humiliation involved like knocking over all their buildings and stuff, like a big bully older brother does with another kid's Lego. It's like, no, they're knocking that stupid, get that crap out of here. It's done, jerk. And then on top of that, they didn't just knock over their things. They also, according to the stories, they plowed up their fields and they put a bunch of salt in there to wreck it so that they could never plant fields again and there could never be a civilization there again. And then Carthage just kind of goes away. And I remember that story from when I was a kid. I remember from pretty early on in school. And then a few years ago, as an adult, I'm repeating that kind of stuff. And I go and look it up to remember all the details. And I'm like, this has been totally debunked. I just thought to myself, just everything that's awesome about childhood gets wrecked. Like all the coolest stories. Did you know that there was no Dracula who was a vampire either? Turns out he was a normal guy. This is the kind of thing that crushes the little boy that still lives inside all of us, but I try to move on anyway. Now, it looks like there was some story that got made up in the 1800s and circulated in a couple of journals, and it got proliferated and repeated like these things do. And it wasn't until a few decades ago that people went and actually looked at it and were like, no, I don't think that's the case. I mean, salt is really expensive. But whatever the case, you look at that and you're like, well, do we salt fields? Do we not salt fields? And then you go to Matthew 13 and you got this story where Jesus is describing basically the same kind of practice. You're like, well, is Jesus describing something that actually happened and that people did? Like, would people come in and try to wreck other people's fields by putting bad seeds in with the already planted good seeds? Or is this like a James Bond kind of fiction where you just imagine a horrible thing that someone might do to try to cause damage and everybody is like, well, that would never happen, but I get it. And so what I want to do today, and all I want to do today, is consider the question of whether this was an actual practice that the original audience would have recognized, or whether this was just a mean fictional thing that Jesus was making up that they could have imagined. Now, either way, I don't think that affects the credibility of Jesus or the text. I mean, he's holding this out as a fictional story, an example, a parable. This doesn't need to be a reference to a thing that actually happens to make his point. The reason I want to talk about it is because I was just curious and I wanted to know. So I went and dug around, and that is what we're going to spend our day on. So, Parable of the Wheat and the Tares, Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30 even, tells a story about this guy who plants good seeds, and this enemy comes in the night and plants bad seeds in there, but the servants are like, hey, what the heck is this stuff that's coming up? What are you doing? What kind of seeds did you plant, master? And the master's like, it wasn't me, it was an enemy. And the servants are like, you want us to go rip that stuff up? And the master's like, no, you'll wreck everything. Let's wait till the end, then we'll be able to tell everything apart, and then we can fix it. And we'll break down more of what's going on with that plant probably tomorrow. But for our purposes today, this practice of sabotaging a field that is described here, it turns out that is a terrible drum roll. It's completely true. This was a thing that did happen in the ancient world, even if it didn't literally happen in the most famous example, which is, of course, the end of the Punic Wars and the destruction of Carthage. Now, you've got all these old Hittite and Assyrian texts that specifically describe this kind of practice. The Assyrians were like the biggest jerks in the ancient world. They were dominant from, there were Assyrian kings back to the 14th century BC, something like that, all the way up to meaningfully into the late 7th century. So, I mean, these guys were awesome. They dominated and they were mean. And if you messed with them, they were very punitive. And so one of the early mega kings of Assyria, a guy named Adad-Nirari, we've got a text where he boasts about planting this plant that I've never heard of, but the text calls it a kudimu. I don't know, got me. But apparently, as it ages out, it turns to lye. It produces this almost natural chemical salt compound as it breaks down and decomposes. And he planted a whole bunch of this in a field of a conquered city-state called Mitanni to absolutely annihilate it and wipe it out. Did that actually happen? I don't know. All we've got is him bragging about having done it, but it at least indicates that the practice was in the consciousness of the ancient Near East, 1,400 years-ish, 1,300 years-ish before Jesus is telling this story. And then again, about 200 years after Adad-nirari, you've got another rock star Assyrian king named Tiglath-Pileser, and he claims, according to one of these discovered texts, that he literally teared, so the same kind of plant that is being described in the parable of Jesus, the city-state of Hunusa after destroying it. Again, the idea here is that these tears, whose characteristics will break down next time around, were the kind of thing that once that was in a field, you really had a serious problem. A few centuries later, another Assyrian rock star king, Ashurbanipal, destroyed Elam and had it salted and teared as well. And these are all well-documented historical characters who overlap with the Old Testament narrative. But in the Old Testament itself, in Judges, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd. There it is. I'm super close. Just a minute. It's going to be great. In Judges 9:44, starting there, Abimelech, the judge, and his companies with him rushed forward to a position at the entrance to the city gate. That would be the city of Shechem. Then 2 companies rushed upon those in the fields and struck them down. All that day, Abimelech pressed his attack against the city until he had captured it and killed its people. Then, smoking gun, he destroyed the city and scattered salt over it. So there's even an example within the same leather binding of the same document, just from the Old Testament, of this practice happening. What did it mean to actually salt somebody's field or tear somebody's field? Like how much tears, how much salt? I have no idea. I don't think that's discernible from the texts that we get here, but it was very obviously the equivalent of playing an online first-person shooter and beating someone who's been frustrating you and just tapping the crouch and uncrouch button over their corpse repeatedly. Like you're just making a point, you're just rubbing it in. Now, again, 149 BC, we have the story of the end of the Punic Wars and Rome doing this to Carthage. That doesn't look like a terribly reliable account. So we might be tempted to think, well, maybe this was a practice in the very ancient world and Jesus is hearkening back to something mostly forgotten from the very, very distant past, except we get something that gives us an indication that the practice of tearing a field, not just as a king punishing a conquered enemy, but as a civil matter between people who don't like each other just in society, it looks like this was a practice that still happened often enough that it had to be addressed in Roman law. And this was a really fun deep dive for me, but here's how it goes. So Justinian is the last great emperor of Rome. He ruled from the eastern half of the empire, so not from the town of Rome itself, but it's still basically Rome at this point. And Justinian's big mission in the 6th century was to restore the glory of Rome, and he viewed the glory of Rome as being descended from the Roman legal tradition. And so what he wanted to do was gather all the Roman laws that had evolved into conflict and mishmash. He wanted to organize it all up into one big unifying code of laws, which ends up being called the Codex Justinianus. And so in the era of Justinian, you have produced these volumes called digests. And these digests are an attempt to codify and unify all of the case law, all of the precedents. I mean, if your government has one situation 20 years ago where somebody does something, they're like, we'll do this, but the same laws are still on the books, and 20 years later, you're like, no, we'll do this completely other thing. The rule of law starts to break down and society collapses. So you got to have consistent judgment, and that's why case law is important. These digests, then, are an attempt to have a dialogue between all of the great legal minds of the past practically millennium from the Roman tradition all at once. Get them all in the same room, compare notes from the stuff that they said, and one of these legal thinkers is a guy named Celsus. So Justinian's legal publishers from the 6th century AD look back to this guy named Celsus, who lived roughly 2 generations after the time of Jesus. He was born in 67, so late in the reign of the Emperor Nero, but certainly in the same time frame as the Gospels are probably being written or circulated. And at that time, we learned that this Celsus guy, who lived from 67 to 130, had observed the problem of people in Roman society tearing other people's fields, sneaking in there at night, just like in this parable, and wrecking their stuff. And one of Celsus's digests points out that if something's going to be a law, it shouldn't be made from a wild, hypothetical, crazy thing that somebody could just imagine or make up. Laws are only justified to deal with things that happen fairly often. So if Celsus then goes on to write about the problem of tearing fields and suggesting that there should be laws regarding it, it would be consistent with his own legal doctrine for us to conclude that tearing other people's fields was a fairly regular occurrence and was a known practice in the Roman world that was common enough that you needed laws on the books to respond to it when it happened. Now, in the course of this, I came across 3 other legal scholars who are not as well documented, who are contemporaries with Jesus, who also confirm what we get in the much more detailed account from Celsus, and that is that tearing a field was a very real thing. So what that tells me is that when Jesus told this parable, he wasn't describing something like you get at the end of every single DC movie, which is, of course, the blue laser pointed at the sky, which is going to bring death to everyone in one form or another, unless you go and stop it. And everybody knows that could never happen, but it's like a hypothetical thing that you can sort of imagine the consequences of. That is not what Jesus is doing here. It is abundantly evident from extra-biblical evidence that he is describing an actual phenomenon. And even though Carthage probably didn't get salted, a whole lot of other places got salted, and a whole lot of other places got teared, and you needed a legal mechanism to deal with it. And even though that's just a little nugget contributing toward a slightly better understanding of this parable and how the people in the original audience would have been feeling as they heard it told for the first time, it is still a little nugget that helps us understand it more like the original audience, that helps us put ourselves in those shoes and track with what Jesus is doing that much more. I really like doing these kind of episodes from time to time. If this is not your cup of tea and you are still here with me, hey, thank you for indulging me on something that I think is really fun and interesting. I appreciate you a ton. I look forward to doing more of this tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.